Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. Our goal in the series is to provide parish staff and volunteers, as well as diocesan ministers, the formation, the training, and the tools that they need to create vibrant Catholic parishes and growing ministries. In today's webinar, Leonard DeLorenzo is going to share with us the lessons that we can learn from St. Joseph in these days of Advent, awaiting the coming of Christ on Christmas. I'm Jared Dees. I'm the content marketing manager here at Ave Maria Press, and I'm joined by Aaron Pierce, who's the parish and curriculum marketing specialist.
Before we begin our webinar, we'd like to recognize our webinar partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priests' Councils.
A few technical details. Everyone in the audience is muted, but you can ask questions, and questions may be sent to the presenter using the question section of the GoToWebinar panel seen on your screen here. Also, the webinar is being recorded, and we'll send a recording out to you later this week to share with your colleagues, or if you're watching the recording, thanks for joining us.
With that, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our presenter. Leonard DeLorenzo is a Catholic author who teaches theology at the University of Notre Dame, where he oversees several programs in the McGrath Institute for Church Life, including Notre Dame Vision. Lenny, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
All right, Lenny, I'm handing over controls to you. You should see a pop-up that says, click here to show my screen.
Will do.
Looks like we're good to go there once you start that presentation.
This is the hardest part of the whole deal. There we go. All right. Whoa. All right. Hi, everyone. So I promise this is me, though that picture that you saw just a moment ago, there was no beard. That was taken 5 years ago. So I've been working towards this moment, as you can see, doing a little bit of work to prepare my presentation style. I want to talk today about one of the great figures of Advent, St. Joseph. But as is his custom, this is one of those figures, St. Joseph, who tends to go unnoticed. But I think that if we take the time to notice him, we're going to learn something about what it means to wait for the Lord. And I'd like to say that waiting for the Lord is indeed the stuff of dreams, but not of daydreaming. Daydreaming, as we often know, we probably all know, is about drifting out of contact with reality. It's a sort of like mindless wandering. It means really not paying attention. In fact, you could say one daydreams in place of or in lieu of paying attention. We're going to talk about St. Joseph, who is a dreamer, but his dreamer, he as a dreamer is the very opposite of not paying attention. His dreaming is actually rooted in paying attention. So what we're going to do here at the beginning is we're just going to look at the very beginning of St. Matthew's Gospel, where we get the figure of St. Joseph most roundly presented to us. And in looking at a few segments of the opening of that Gospel, I want us to try to see what his dreaming has to do with paying attention. So here we go. This is part one. There'll be 3 parts of our little time together. Part one will be on dreaming. And as I mentioned, there are a few dreams that come to us here in the beginning of Matthew's Gospel. In fact, we're going to look at 3 of them: Dream 1, Dream 2, Dream 3. So I'm going to pull up the first segment. I'm going to read that to you. Then I'm going to make some points about it. Then we're going to move on to the other 2. And we're going to try and notice some patterns. So here's the first one, Dream 1, which comes in the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verses 18 through 25. Now, the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be with child of the Holy Spirit, and her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to send her away quietly. But as he considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sin. When Joseph woke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but knew her not, until she had borne a son, and he called his name Jesus. Now, I want to point out a few things here. Remember, we're going to be looking for what does Joseph's dreaming have to do with paying attention? Well, right before we're told that Joseph has a dream, notice that we're told that he was considering what he had observed. He knew quite well that the one to whom he was betrothed, Mary, was with child. He's paying attention to the situation. In some way, he can't help but pay attention to it. But he's considering it. He's mulling it over in his mind. Though he was resolved in a certain way, he's considering, trying to allow what's happening to kind of roll around and to sink in and to continue to come back to it. He's considering it. He has set his mind on his conditions. He's not daydreaming, escaping from his conditions, trying to wish them away. He's paying attention to them. He knows what's going on, and he's thinking about it. And it's precisely then that we're told that Joseph dreams. Have you ever had an experience where, because I know I have, you've been thinking about something so much, it's so much on your mind, it's a problem perhaps that you have to solve, it's something at work, it's something in a personal relationship, and you're just mulling it over, and there's no apparent way out of it, or you can't figure out what to do, or you're just troubled by it, and it's just occupying your mind. And then maybe you take a nap, or maybe you just release the tension of your mind for just a moment. And all of a sudden, the insight comes to you. Ah, there's the thing to do. There's the solution. There's the answer. There's the right path. I've had that kind of experience. I imagine you have too. It's like it comes to us when we sleep. If our mind is really holding on to something very tightly, we're almost consumed with it. We're paying such close attention to it. When we release the tension at a particular time, when we're not trying so hard, all of the fruit of working on that thing in our mind seems to come to fruition. We have the insight. And I think something like that might be going on here. I don't mean to psychologize this, but I do want to say that we should notice the relationship between Joseph's dream here and his attentiveness to what's going on. That's the first pattern I want us to pay attention to. We'll see it again in the next two dreams. But I also want to ask you to see if you can discern a second pattern that's common in each of these three dreams. I'm going to leave that one unspoken. I'll comment on it at the end. But the first one I'm saying is the relationship between attentiveness and dreaming, and then there's a second pattern that we'll comment on in the end. All right, so there's the first dream. What about the second dream? Well, what happens in between the first and second dream is we're told about the Magi who are coming from the east. On their way towards Bethlehem, they have stopped by the local monarch's place, Herod, and Herod is inquisitive. He wants to know about this king that has been born in his province. And so he asked the wise men when they saw the star appear and where they're going, and he requests of them that when they're returning home, that they stop back by his place to let him know where he can find this child king so he can go and pay him homage. We're told that the wise men go to Mary and Joseph. They do pay homage to the young king, but they have a dream themselves in which they hear a voice telling them not to go back to Herod, and so they go home a different way. They knew something was fishy about this dude, Herod. So here's dream 2, which picks up right from there. Now, when the wise men departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there till I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he, Joseph, rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. Like I said, the wise men clearly knew there was something fishy about Herod. They had a dream, in fact, that he wasn't to be trusted. Perhaps their own observations, their own instincts came together and they knew that is the wrong course of action. We're going back another way. Now, it doesn't tell us here, but if they had a sense of that, if they knew that, don't you think before they left the house, they told the child's mother and father that Herod had it out for their kid, that Herod was aware that this child had been born, that wise men were coming to seek him, that something was going on there? Don't you think that the wise men said something to Mary and Joseph? I would say that it seems clearly implied in what's being written here at the beginning of Matthew's gospel. So in other words, the wise men who change their course right before they leave the house most likely told Mary and Joseph, and it is right then when the wise men depart that Joseph has his second dream. In other words, for the second time, his attentiveness to what's going on is connected to what he hears in his dream. So then let's go to the third dream. The third dream, Joseph takes Mary and the child Jesus. They go into Egypt, as we know. Herod flies into a fit of rage. He knows that the wise men have deceived him. He orders that all of the male children, 2 years of age and younger, be slaughtered in his area. The crying of the mothers makes its way all across the land. We can imagine that some kind of report went out that this was talked about. And so, as Joseph and Mary and the child Jesus flee to Egypt, the cries of the children, of the mothers of the children, in some ways are following them. But then we hear that Herod dies. That news likely travels also. And here's the third dream. When Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he, Joseph, rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Egypt, or to Israel, I'm sorry. The setting here, they're in exile, they're refugees, they're estranged from their homeland until the threat abates. The cries of those mothers, of those infant boys who are murdered, make their way all across the land. Herod dies, the news travels, then Joseph dreams. He hears a response to what he's been paying attention to yet again. So I said, in each of these three dreams, we have this first pattern that I think we should pay a little bit more attention to. In each case, Joseph's dreaming comes right after the statements about the circumstances. In the first dream, or right before the first dream, we're told that he considers what's going on. And I think we should easily infer that about the next two dreams too. Joseph is the man who considers, who takes in what's going on around him. When he dreams, that's when the clarity comes, when the struggle eases in some way and a path shows itself forward. Is this divinely inspired? Absolutely. No doubt it's divinely inspired. But still, it is still connected to the good old-fashioned work of human attentiveness. The good old-fashioned work of human attentiveness as to what is going on and the clarity that comes in the dream of what to do. But I said there's a second pattern we should pay attention to here, and I wonder if you notice what the second pattern is. The second pattern is that in addition to the attentiveness leading into the dreams, when Joseph in his dreams receives this word of clarity, he wakes and he goes right away. In each of those three dreams, he wakes and he goes right away. That's the second pattern. Just to kind of tie this all together, there's maybe a part B to dream number 3. So let's just look at that. Dream 3, part B, which also has to do with the coming back into Israel. They're on their way back to Israel, but when he, Joseph, heard that Archelaus reigned over Judea in place of his father Herod, this guy who already had a reputation, Joseph was afraid to go there, and, oh, by the way, being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. Here again, he, Joseph, perceives, and he's fearful about what he perceives. He dreams, and he becomes convicted. He receives clarity, and right away, he acts without delay. He changes his course and moves. So there's a pattern, this pattern of perceiving, of dreaming or clarity coming, and then the quickness, the promptness of action. Let's pull that all together a little bit. Part 1 on dreaming. Joseph, the dreamer. The three things I just said. 1, what we see in the figure of Joseph here at the beginning of Matthew's gospel is that here is someone who pays attention to what's going on around him, to his concrete circumstances, to the conditions of others that are around him. Secondly, he waits for clarity. In some ways, you could say he's open to things being clarified for him. He pays attention, then he waits for clarity. And then the third thing, when clarity comes, he goes in haste. So I want to make 3 points about waiting on the Lord here from the figure of St. Joseph. Point 1, waiting on the Lord is active. Paying attention is not a passive posture. It's actually setting your eyes, setting your ears, setting your heart, setting your mind on what's going on around you. Waiting on the Lord is active. Secondly, waiting on the Lord is patient. Joseph waits for clarity to come. He doesn't act impulsively. He mulls these things over in his mind. He considers, as it says in chapter 1 of Matthew's gospel, and he waits upon clarity. Waiting on the Lord is patient. But then also the third point, waiting on the Lord is decisive. It's about moving towards a decision when clarity comes. He goes in haste when the way has been opened to him, when he's prompted by the word of the Lord, when the angel whispers in his ear in sleep. Now, we might think ourselves about this sort of swiftness of Joseph. Well, goodness, I too would be so swift to obey if the Lord would just do me the favor every once in a while of sending an angel to speak in my ear while I sleep. If I had angels appearing to me in my dream, of course I would get up and do exactly what the angels would say. But would we? Or maybe we might think, do we? Do we really act as promptly as that? Should we take it for granted that this is such an obvious thing that you would hear the way forward and just go? I want to think again about these 3 dreams that Joseph has, and I want us to think about what might, for him, have gotten in the way of this prompt obedience. And maybe we can think of ourselves in this situation. So let's look at these 3 dreams and just consider momentarily what might get in the way of prompt obedience. So here's dream 1, the consequences of Mary's pregnancy. What would the consequences be? Well, we know this for sure, the consequence of scandal. This would raise up a great scandal surrounding not only Mary, but now Joseph in their betrothal. All that would have to be born there to be associated with what seems like improper activity. Secondly, the loss of prestige, his loss of prestige. Third, this is clearly not what I, Joseph, have envisioned. I had another vision of what this marriage would look like, of what my life would look like. And that is being, it seems, taken away. There's a loss of freedom, as every parent knows. There's a loss of freedom in receiving a child or receiving a definite mission. You no longer have the latitude to choose this way or that. But with a mission, and certainly with a child, there is a duty to be performed. The loss, taking up a duty, that fourth point, is related in that sense to a sort of loss of freedom, of this sort of latitude to go this way or that. But then this question, which isn't just a question I make up, it's actually a question of St. Peter later in this Gospel of Matthew. It's a question that the sons of Zebedee ask in a certain way. What's in it for me? That could get in the way, pondering, thinking over those consequences of Mary's pregnancy. And you could hesitate for a short period of time or for quite a long period of time, worrying about those consequences, those as sort of obstacles getting in the way of prompt obedience. Well, let's think about the second dream then, the consequences of the flight to Egypt. Certainly it's abandoning home. Nobody likes to move. I imagine he didn't either. Abandoning property, this perilous journey. I mean, look, y'all, I don't even like to drive my kids across town during rush hour. He's taking his family with a newborn to Egypt on this perilous journey. Nobody's looking forward to that. He's subject to a foreign people and foreign customs, moving to the land of Egypt. For me, and I hope no one takes offense at this would be like me moving to Texas. I would be under the customs of a foreign people. This would be very concerning to me. It would cause great hesitation. I imagine going from Israel to Egypt, no less. Third, there's just more uncertainty. What will this look like when we get there? What will this mean for the next step? Where does this end? And the certain hardship that will come, not only from the journey and not only from what you find there, but from everything that will follow. The consequences of the flight to Egypt, there's plenty of reason to pause and be concerned and second guess and wait. Well, how about dream number 3, the consequences of the return to Israel, which seems like, well, this is just clearly good news and giddy up, let's go. Well, it's moving again. How many people have moved more than once? If you've moved more than once, that second move you always dread, and every one thereafter. So it's moving again. It's starting over again. It's yet another perilous journey in the other direction. It's facing your relatives, going home and explaining things, facing your wife's relatives in this case for him. And not only that, there's a nice little wrinkle here. He's not even able to go back to his hometown. Remember, he hears about the new guy in charge and he has to divert path to go and set up your life in yet another town, in a new town. And then what else? What's to come next? What are the next set of hardships that might come? All of these, I'm just suggesting, would be very clear opportunities to pause and to dawdle and to hesitate and not to promptly obey a word, even though it seems so clear that an angel whispers in your ear while you sleep. Now, I imagine that most people have had an experience of having just clarity about what the right thing to do in a situation is, in a relationship with somebody else, in a work situation, and especially when the thing that becomes so clear to us is difficult. We probably, most of us, know what it's like to just hesitate, to wait, to not do the hard thing right away, even though we know for sure it's the right thing to do. And what happens when we wait? What happens when we don't act in haste when clarity comes? Well, what normally happens is that we find ways of justifying doing other things, of not doing this one thing that became so clear, especially when it's difficult and demanding. We find all kinds of opportunity for second guessing the clarity that we received, even though in the moment, after we've waited for clarity, we were so certain this is the way forward. If we wait, if we're not promptly obedient, all of those little voices, those other voices about other possibilities, about reasons not to do this one necessary thing, all of those start creeping in. Obedience here, for the dreamer, Joseph, obedience means when clarity comes to go in haste. Now is the time to act promptly. You could think about this as an alternate example about a doctor, right? So if we want to talk about Joseph the dreamer or the obedient one, what does it mean to be an obedient, a prudent doctor? Because you're really getting an image of Joseph, the prudent man here. Well, a prudent doctor, you want to be open to what's going on, to take in, to make a thorough diagnosis, to see all of the symptoms, to pay attention to what's going on with your body, with your emotions, with your psyche, all the symptoms of what might be going on with you. And then the prudent doctor will consider all of these, will weigh them, will come up perhaps with a hypothesis, and then kind of sit with that hypothesis and make sure that the diagnosis is correct. But once clarity comes and once the doctor sees what's wrong, especially like a surgeon, let's say, the prudent surgeon who was prudent in the first place for not being impulsive will now be prudent by acting in haste, by doing the thing that must be done when clarity comes. I think you can see a parallel example here with Saint Joseph. Prudence on the first hand is waiting for clarity, and on the second hand is to move promptly in obedience when clarity comes. Just like with the doctor, or if you wanted to run this out in yet another direction, you could think of a running back waiting for a hole to open up in a football game, but we'll leave that to the side. Okay, so here's the first point, part one on dreaming. Saint Joseph the dreamer, who pays attention, who waits for clarity, who goes in haste. Oh, I guess I should have moved into those earlier. There they are, a little bit closer up. Let's go to our second point then. And I call this on introductions. I kind of want to go back to where we began by looking at some of the first verses of Matthew's gospel. The reason I want to do this is because the first thing that we hear about people in scripture is always very important. But I think we have a habit of moving past the first thing we hear because we want to sort of get to the action, to find out what happens, to see where the little message is. So we have a habit of jumping over introductions. So let's go back to the introduction to Saint Joseph, the first thing that we hear about him personally, which is this. It's not the first time it's mentioned, but it's the first time he's sort of featured, the first time he is sort of personally introduced. It says, and her husband, Mary's husband, Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her, Mary, to shame, resolved to send her away quietly. But as he considered this, and then it goes on. Here's the first sort of close-up portrait, the first sort of snapshot of the character of Saint Joseph, his personal introduction. The first thing we're told is a just man. He is a just man. But we may not have a sense of what that means. So St. Matthew, in laying this out, tells us two more things about St. Joseph. He resolves, he is resolved, and he considers. And I just want to suggest this to you. To be resolved is to have a firm disposition. He has a firm disposition on what he's going to do and why he's going to do it. He has a certain characteristic to him, and he's resolved in that. And yet he considers, he remains open, he wrestles with what's going on. I bring this up in a way to kind of talk about the opposite, because I think a way to try and understand what the just man is here, Joseph the just man, is to look to a sort of contrasting figure, an unjust man. And I actually want to pair Joseph here then with an Old Testament figure, and that is the Pharaoh of Egypt. Not the Pharaoh that we find in Genesis, but the Pharaoh that we find at the beginning of the book of Exodus. These are different pharaohs separated by about 400 years. Joseph, not Saint Joseph, but the son of Jacob, Joseph, also a dreamer, who had taken the whole people of Israel eventually down into Egypt. He had served the previous Pharaoh by interpreting dreams, by actually ensuring and increasing the wealth of the Egyptians, of actually increasing the power of that Pharaoh, the kingdom of Egypt. 400 years have gone by the time we pick up the story in the book of Exodus. And here is what we read about one of the key figures then, another Pharaoh. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that when there befalleth us any war, they also join themselves unto our enemies and fight against us and get them up out of the land." When we're told that this Pharaoh knew not Joseph, what does that mean in the book of Exodus? It means that this Pharaoh, the one who's here at the beginning of Exodus, does not remember, has no memory of, is not in any way connected to Joseph, who concludes the book of Genesis, who was there 400 years prior, who accrued and increased the wealth of the Egyptians, to whom he himself, Pharaoh, owes so much of his power because of the way in which Joseph secured the power of the Egyptians then and the Pharaoh then. He has no memory of that Joseph. He has no reason, you could say, for gratitude. And that is a very important thing to know about him. I'd also like to kind of make the point here that in light of the gospel, we could allow ourselves to think about the Joseph mentioned there, he knew not Joseph, as Saint Joseph. Of course, he wouldn't know about Saint Joseph well into the future, but we might also see he knew not Joseph as a point of contrast between this Pharaoh and Saint Joseph who is to come in terms of their character. How so? Well, because this is the portrait of the unjust man, who is contrasted with the portrait of the just man to come later. What is the first thing that we find out about Pharaoh in the book of Exodus? Again, we have a tendency to jump over introductions, but the introduction is so important. The first thing that we find out about Pharaoh is that he has an agenda. He has an agenda, and he speaks it here. His agenda is, it seems, to hold down the power of the Hebrews living under his control. But what's that agenda really? That agenda really is to secure his own power, to make sure that he and his kingdom are not threatened and certainly not overthrown. That is this Pharaoh's primary objective. It is what runs his heart from the beginning to the end of the narrative. We find out the one truly necessary thing about this Pharaoh right from the beginning. With that agenda to hold on to power, as he sees the Israelites growing in number in his land, he sees this as a threat to his power. His agenda then teaches him how to interpret his situation accordingly. The growth of the Israelites is seen as a threat to my power. His agenda is to hold on to power. Therefore, he sees the Israelites as a potential enemy. And all of his actions, therefore, forward from there, will be directed by that fundamental decision, by that fundamental disposition. The very first thing we find out about Pharaoh is the most decisive thing. That's where his heart is set, on protecting his power. Now, in the time of our Joseph, Saint Joseph, who reveals himself as a Pharaoh figure? Herod. Herod is the new Pharaoh. He has an agenda, doesn't he? When the wise men come to him, he's already set his mind and his heart on a certain way of interpreting things. He is utterly obsessed with protecting his own power. And he's trying to shape conditions, everything that's going on, in order to protect his own power. And he's hiding his agenda. All of his actions from there forward will flow from that primary decision. For us, who aren't Pharaohs and who aren't Herods, we might think about how you can't really hear the word of the Lord, and how you can't really wait for the Lord when you're preoccupied, when your attention is split, when you're trying to take care of too many priorities at once, when your heart is all over the place, or when you're calculating with a hidden agenda, with hidden fears. Just like this Pharaoh and just like Herod, to have this hidden agenda, the first thing, the sort of core of the heart, determines whether we'd be willing to listen and wait, or whether we'll color and interpret the things that happen according to our own fears or what we want to see in the first place. So let's round out this second part on introductions. Saint Joseph, the just man, who I want to say is the foil to Herod and to every Pharaoh, he shows us what it means to wait for the Lord. Saint Joseph is not distracted. He's very focused on what's going on. He's paying attention. And therefore, his waiting is active. Secondly, he's not impulsive. He desires clarity. He doesn't act before it's time. He'll wait, and waiting is patient. Third, he's certainly not timid. When clarity comes, he acts immediately, because this waiting, the waiting for the Lord, is decisive. It's not his own agenda. He's waiting for the agenda, the word of the Lord, to become clear to him. These, and I won't comment on this too much, are also the three dimensions of the virtue of prudence. Joseph is presented to us as the prudent man, or we could say that we come to understand the virtue of prudence very much in relation to the figure of Saint Joseph. An openness to reality, to being attentive, a struggle, the continual struggle and work to remain open, to consider, to reconsider, to deliberate, to wait for clarity, and then when clarity comes, to act in haste, solertia, to act in haste, like a good doctor again, or a good running back. Okay, that's part two on introductions. The first part on Joseph the Dreamer, the second part on introductions. I want to bring this then to just a third part, which I'll call on obedience. I want us to see how important Joseph's obedience to waiting for the Lord is, and you could say in the grand scheme of things. And you actually get a word about the grand scheme of things at the very beginning of Matthew's gospel. At the very beginning of Matthew's gospel, we meet the genealogy, or we're given the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And if we skip over introductions most of the time when we're reading scripture, we certainly skip over genealogies much more quickly because they seem so unimportant and they're just taking up space. And I can get credit for reading the whole chapter if I just read the things that come before and after the genealogy and skip over this part. Nobody will care. Well, the genealogy here is actually quite important. And let's see why. This genealogy begins, as it says, from the person of Abraham. And it goes all the way to Jesus there at the end. But it's divided into three parts. From Abraham, sorry, it's cut off a little bit on the screen, but from Abraham to David, the king. That's the first part. Then from David to the deportation to Babylon. That's the second part. Then from the deportation of Babylon to Jesus. And if you count the generations in each of those three parts, there are 14 generations in each. 14, 14, 14. Now, you may be interested in this. This isn't quite my point, but 14 is actually, ready? The numerical value of the Hebrew letters that form the name David. Okay, that's one point, but it's not my main point. Here's the main point. If you add 14 together 3 times, you have 3 sections of 14, 14, 14, 14. What does that equal? 42. We're told of 42 generations. Okay, great. 42 generations. Does that have any possible significance? In fact, it does. And let me show you how. If we were to look deeper into the text, you could say, or back behind the text, and we went to the book of Numbers, we would find in the book of Numbers, chapter 33, the telling of the marches of the Israelites, the journey of the Israelites on their way from Egypt to Canaan, on their way from the land of slavery to the land of freedom, on the way from the place where they were imprisoned to the place where their covenant will be fulfilled. These marches of the Israelites, which begin their first camp at Ramesses and go all the way to Canaan, guess how many stops there are? 42. There are 42 stops between slavery in Egypt and freedom in Canaan, between the promise of freedom and the promised land. Now, we know that the Israelites are, in one sense, free when they pass through the Red Sea. But in another way, they're very much not yet free because their hearts are still back in Egypt, because they're slow to listen to the Lord, because they're not really free to worship yet. They're still tied up in their slavery. There are 42 stops, you could say, from God's pledge to their acceptance of God's pledge. There are 42 stops, a long journey, that are the movements of them being made ready and willing to wait on and welcome the Lord. So when we see in the genealogy at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, there are 42 stops from Abraham to the Messiah, Jesus, from the promise of the covenant to its final fulfillment. We should be reminded of that journey from slavery to freedom, to receiving in full who the Lord is, the fulfillment of the promise. And what does this have to do with Saint Joseph? Well, Saint Joseph is the last in the line before Jesus. He's the one that connects Jesus to this lineage of Abraham. He's coupled with his wife Mary, so Joseph is number 41. Jesus here is 42. This genealogy is Israel's journey, and it's now, as Christians, our journey to freely receive Christ. Let's be clear about this. Mary is always the one who gives us Jesus, but she is always linked, as she is here, to Joseph, her spouse. He's the last in the great line of sinners seeking redemption, the great line of sinners who must learn what it means to wait for the Lord. Joseph is, in this sense, we could say, the first redeemed sinner who is made worthy to take the Lord under his roof. He, Joseph, who pays attention, who is open, and who acts decisively, he is obedient to the word of the Lord in concrete circumstances, precisely what the Israelites journeying for those 40 years in the desert, all 42 stops, were learning how to become. I want us to have a chance here towards the closing to glance then on this point about obedience to the other gospel that speaks of the infancy of Jesus, the Gospel of Luke. So thinking on one hand about the Gospel of Matthew and the genealogy and the figure of Joseph there, I want to look at the end of the infancy narrative in Luke's Gospel, chapter 2. And I want us to see what it says about Joseph and Jesus and Mary there. So here's the end of the infancy narrative, which I won't read in full. We know that Jesus has been left in the temple when he is 12. Mary and Joseph travel 3 days out before they realize he's gone, come back to receive him, and they find him in the temple. And after 3 days, verse 46, They found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when they, Mary and Joseph, saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been looking for you anxiously." Your father and I have been looking for you anxiously. And Jesus said to them, "How is it that you sought me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" Let's pause there for a moment. This silent figure of Joseph, who we know so well never speaks in Scripture, this silent figure of Joseph, who here in Luke's Gospel is there at all the moments with Mary except for her Annunciation, who himself marvels and wonders at what Mary will pull into her heart and ponder. He's here. He hears both what his wife says and what his child says. On this day, the last day that we're told of in Jesus' infancy narrative, here is what Joseph hears. "Your father and I have been looking for you. Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" So let's consider for a moment, in Joseph's silence, what could possibly pass here? Could it not be the possibility of resentment, my Father's house? The possibility of humiliation? Or all of those reasons to grow cold and bitter and distant and secretive? Joseph, who could say, "But what about my kingdom? What about my household?" Or Joseph, who could think, "What about my agenda and my plans?" Or Joseph, who could think, "What about my ideas of how this should go?" When this boy says, "My Father's house." But in his silence, what does Joseph do? And this is where I think the Gospel of Matthew can help us read the Gospel of Luke. Joseph is attentive. He's there. He's paying attention. He's waiting actively. He doesn't impose his interpretations. He's patient. He listens. And thirdly, he takes the boy home. He's decisive. He takes him home. Verse 50. And they did not understand the saying which he spoke to him. And he, Jesus, went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. He went down to Nazareth with them. Where did he go? Into Joseph's house, the house that Joseph built. He, with Mary, takes Jesus down to Nazareth. He takes Joseph into the house that he built. And under his roof, Joseph's, the Son of God, was obedient to him and to Mary. There is something profound and astounding here about these echoes of obedience. Joseph, who in his silence waits upon the word and then acts decisively, and the very word of God, who himself goes into Joseph's house and is obedient to him. I want to sort of end here and allow us to kind of contemplate this for a little bit. This figure of Joseph who might teach us quite a lot about what it means to wait for the Lord. And so I want to give you a dual meditation, if you will, just something to listen to, and then we'll open it up for any comments or questions you have. So here's the last piece, a dual meditation. Under the mantle of his virgin mother and under the cloak of his chaste father, the Lord of the cosmos, who is quite at home in God's house as God's only begotten Son, is raised in obedience. That is more than fitting. It is part of the mystery of who Jesus is, the obedient Son of God, who only ever does his Father's will. And God, the Father, willed that his only begotten Son should have someone like us to call Dad. We can thank Saint Joseph for humbly submitting to the roles of husband and father, not on his own terms, but on God's terms. Through his spousal union with Mary, our salvation grew. Joseph is a model and guide for us in our Advent journeys, and really always, because he shows us what it means to be open to the gift of salvation, to make a home for the Son of God through our practices of obedience, through prayer and longing and discipleship through mercy. The Son of God was also the Son of Mary. And one of the great wonders of God's gift to us is that he allowed Joseph, a sinner like us, to also say about Jesus what Joseph never even dreamed of asking God, to be able to call God's own son, my beloved son. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lenny. Give me 1 second. I'll pull up the reminder of questions here.
Okay.
We've got a couple coming in already, which is great.
Ooh. Hello?
You're good.
Okay, there we are. Sorry.
Good. So yeah, so now would be the time if you want to ask any questions or comments about Lenny's presentation about St. Joseph. Thank you so much for offering those insights. It's one of those things where, like you said, St. Joseph, he doesn't say anything in the Gospels, and yet it may be easy to pass on by what the significance is of, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, his role in the dreams. I really appreciated the connections you made between those three and the way in which you laid out how he was obedient. Just kind of curious from your own personal experience of Advent so far. We're getting close to the Advent end of the Advent season. What personally are you doing with your family? Or you know, in your own personal prayer life, spiritual life, to integrate some of these principles, this year?
Yeah, it's hilariously appropriate that we have a newborn this Advent season,
Yeah.
which seems like, well, that is the perfect opportunity for preparing for waiting for the Lord. And yet, as anybody knows with a newborn, newborns throw all the best possible schedules up in the air. And so in some ways, like, our family's practice and obedience right now is being very attentive to the newborn and to my wife and to everybody's adjustments. So, we try to stick to our regular evening prayer, and as we've done as a family, but it's much more difficult right now. And so we adapt and sort of adopt practices for praying as a family as we're going through Advent. Our kids, they set up creches around our house and they kind of move around the different figures. So that's part of what they do, and they create art during Advent. In terms of like becoming obedient and listening, I think a lot of that has to do with us like just taking little bits of scripture during our night prayer through a little resource we have, and having one of our kids read it and try and just spend just a little bit of time with it as a family. Though, time's limited when you have 6 kids, or even if you have 1 kid. And so we do our best to be attentive there. My wife and I also have kind of our own practices that we try and take on, that hopefully also feed our family.
There we go. Sorry, I was
Okay.
muted.
Okay.
One of the things that struck me was the waiting for clarity, Joseph waiting for clarity. And I think sometimes we want to fix a problem, resolve a problem, right? What would you maybe suggest? What are ways for us to grow that practice of patience and waiting for God to give us clarity?
Yeah, I think this comes back to a regular, maybe even daily practice of a sort of examination of conscience. Maybe it is an examen or something like that. I was born in northern New Jersey. I was raised in Southern California. I have like a fast pace to me. I want to like get things done. But one of the problems is I'm not always very aware of like what my real motivations are. What's my agenda? Why am I really seeking to do these things? And I think only the daily habitual practice of really sitting quietly, and I think like silence is there's no other way to do this. You have to be silent. To be silent and to really pray in silence and to be honest with myself and ask the Lord to help me kind of evaluate my motivations is the only way to check, like, why do I so want this to turn out that way? Why am I trying to like manage this situation in that direction, whether it's with my kids or with my work or with, stuff at our parish or whatever it is. And so I think that is a regular practice of a Christian disciple. It's a basic human practice of being silent and allowing ourselves to check our motivations. Sometimes that can be with a spiritual director. Sometimes it can be through journaling. I think it has to be a daily practice. I think that's what kind of knocking the dust off our sandals is a little bit about, being honest with ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
We've got a lot of comments coming in. Lee's saying no
Okay.
questions, but I just wanted to say thank you. That was awesome. Thank you. And some others coming in as
Okay.
well. One kind of simple, how much older than Mary was Joseph, and what do we know about the death of Joseph?
Oh, good. Questions that I don't know the answers to. I mean, from what I've heard, I rely on what I learned from others that, and I've read these things in different ways, but it seems that Joseph was probably considerably older than Mary, whether it's 20 or 40 years, who knows? There's a tradition that he was a widow, or a widower. There's a tradition that when we hear about the brothers of Jesus, that these were Joseph's children from another marriage. From the best, that I've read scholarship and pastoral teaching on this, that's probably not the best interpretation, but it is. It seems very clear that Joseph was quite a bit older. As to Joseph's death, I think this is part of what's just passes in his silence. We don't hear anything more about him after that day in the temple. And so it's sort of left to the hidden life of Jesus, not the secret life of Jesus. The hidden life of Jesus in Nazareth, that also is the hidden life of Joseph. And his death is part of the mystery of that life of Jesus. We'll every once in a while see murals or paintings of Jesus at the bedside of Joseph as he dies. Here at Notre Dame on campus in our basilica, we have a painting of that, which, if you think about it, it really is a kind of interpretation on that last line of the second chapter of Luke, that Jesus went down to Nazareth and was obedient to him as a son, honoring Joseph as his father, and in that way fulfilling the commandment to honor your father and your mother, that he, as part of the divine plan of salvation, took this man Joseph as the one to whom he gave the honor of a son to a father. And I think rather than having that be something that we are bashful about or kind of shy away from, that should be part of what we marvel at. It's part of the humility of God and the beauty of not only who Christ is, but also who Saint Joseph was allowed to be for him.
We've got another question here.
Okay.
Thinking of the parable of the prodigal family, is Joseph an icon of the correct attitude for the older brother?
Holy cow. I just wrote a long reflection on that, which of course, like when I write something, I think it's totally original and nobody's ever thought of it, but clearly I'm late to the game. I actually think so. And maybe you heard some of that coming out in what I said at the end. I don't know if that's something that just struck me in reflecting on Luke's gospel on my own. I usually find that when I think I've come to an insight, I put things together that I've read somewhere else, or I'm recalling something that I learned 10 years ago and I forgot that I learned it. But I think that bitterness, the potential for bitterness, is what Joseph swallows up in silence. I think we can sympathize with Joseph there in the contrast of those two lines, your father and I, and did you not know that I must be in my father's house? I actually think that what Jesus says there at the end of Luke 2, did you not know that I must be in my father's house, is actually what both the brothers and the prodigal son say to each other. Did you not know that I must be in my father's house? The younger brother says it to the older, and the older says it to the younger. And they both have to learn not just how to accept it, but how to celebrate it. And I do think that is a beautiful insight, that Joseph, in that sense, in the household that Jesus lived in, was perhaps an image of what that prodigal, or the older brother that he later tells the parable about, would be if he would do it, if he would allow his heart to be converted. If the Pharisees who are listening allowed their hearts to be converted and welcomed in the sinners and the tax collectors.
Interesting.
Lenny, just to make some other connections with this, just to expand your thesis, you got some expertise in the saints. Any saints that come to mind that also kind of apply this process of, I don't know if discernment is the right word, but attention, clarity, and then going in haste?
Yeah, probably all of them, but I'll pick one. How about Saint Maximilian Kolbe? Saint Maximilian is one of those saints who's famous for how he died, in that way, like Saint Gianna Beretta Molla. And I think with these saints who are famous for how they died, we sometimes are very quick to pass over how they lived and what is actually consummated in their death. Saint Maximilian, as I studied him and learned about him, and really through my son, first of all, who has a devotion to him, I came to marvel at the regular practices that Maximilian took on. He regularly fasted throughout his life. He, as a superior of what was then probably one of the largest seminaries in the world, took a small and scant room and made his time open and available to others to whom he was a superior. He paid attention to the needs of others and made a practice both for himself of confessing his sins and encouraging others to regularly confess their sins. I bring these things up because Maximilian, it seemed, was utterly obedient to his vows and lived them with both focus and zeal. And then when we come to the end of his life, where he's in the concentration camp, if we pay attention to what is told about him in the concentration camp, he actually is living through the very form that he exercised throughout the rest of his life. The fasting that he practiced all those years in the concentration camp, where there literally were not enough calories to sustain life, he gave over his rations to others to feed others. In a place where everybody accused everyone else, and the only way it seemed to survive was to be on your own and to cut others down, he exercised both charitable speaking, and he found ways to practice and to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation, that he heard confessions regularly. And ultimately, he, who is the superior of others and practiced giving over his place to others time and again, as we know from the way he died, he gave his place both in standing in for a man who was condemned, but then in the starvation cell where he died with others, of nourishing them all the way through their death, so they lived into a good death in the harshest possible realities. So I think Saint Maximilian is a sterling figure of what a sort of spirituality of Saint Joseph looks like, this sort of silent, humble obedience lived out through long years that bears much fruit.
Aaron, I don't know if you want to pick from one of those questions that we have left, or
Yep. There's another
one more.
question here. Maria says she appreciates the 3 dimensions of waiting based on the reflection of Joseph. What would be some ways to encourage men to follow the example of Joseph?
Oh no, you're asking me to diagnose myself. Because I have to do this. I mean, I've learned a lot of this through marriage, and I'm not saying that all men, we know that not all men are married, and this isn't the special charism of married men, but the practice of having to listen for, those who are married or those who have witnessed married people, that, you probably know something about my wife. Sometimes she wants to tell me things and she doesn't want me to fix them. What does she want me to do? She wants me to listen at the end of the day. I'm so quick to want to fix it because that's just part of my agenda as a fixer, as somebody who wants to be efficient. But the practice, I think this comes, what I said earlier, in terms of like a daily examination of conscience, the practice of a husband to his wife, of actually just asking real questions and really listening, not listening for what I want to hear or what I can fix real quick. But also, I think the practice in any conversation with colleagues, with friends, to really ask the question like, how are you doing? What are you going through? and allow a conversation to really develop and wade through those periods of boredom and awkwardness just to really listen to each other. I don't think that's just for men. I think it's for men and women, but I think maybe that's part of like developing, healing a sort of toxic masculinity, is developing this prudent, strong, disciplined, open masculinity. Maybe you could say a masculinity of listening.
Mhm. Great.
Good. Well, I think it's 4 o'clock now, so we'll maybe wrap things up for the day. Lenny, just where can people go to find out more about you, find out more about your work? We'll talk about your books in just a second here, but
Sure. Well, against my better judgment, I launched my own website, which is leonardjdelorenzo.com, where there's information about my books and things. Our institute, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, a lot of programming, publications, and whatnot. You can find us online at mcgrath.nd.edu. So those would probably be the two places.
Great.
Mhm.
I'll I'll talk a little bit about the 2 books that we've published with Lenny. The first book, Witness, and most recently, What Matters Most. If you can get both of these books, I know these are not Advent books, and this is more of an Advent presentation, but we thought since we got Lenny here, we might as well offer a little discount on the books here before Christmas. Webinar 1218, you'll get 20% off of both books if you use that promo code here by the end of that, well, by December 28th.
Sounds good.
And once again, before we sign off, we'd like to thank our partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. Feel free to check out their websites too with their addresses here on the screen.
And as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have this webinar being recorded. You can find other recordings of this and all the webinars in this series at youtube.com/AveMaryPress or at AveMaryPress.com/webinar-videos. And this is the last webinar for the series, right, Aaron?
Yes, it sure is. Yep. We're in the process of, putting together the spring 2019 webinar series, which you can always sign up at AveMariaPress.com/webinars.
Good. So we're looking forward to being back after the holidays. So God bless everybody. Take care. Thanks, Lenny.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.